Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It was a late summer night in the city, the kind where the humidity clings to your skin even after the sun has long set. I'd just finished a grueling shift at the coffee shop downtown, the one tucked between the high-rises and the old theater district. My feet ached from standing all day, and all I wanted was to get home to my tiny apartment in Brooklyn, collapse on the couch, and binge-watch something mindless. The clock on my phone read 10:58 p.m. as I descended into the subway station, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. The platform was sparsely populated at that hour. A couple of tired commuters scrolling on their phones. A homeless guy bundled in layers despite the warmth. And the distant echo of a busker playing guitar somewhere up the stairs. I positioned myself near the edge, under one of the brighter lights, as I'd learned to do from years of navigating the city alone. That's when I first noticed him. A man on the opposite platform, across the tracks. He was middle-aged, maybe in his 40s, with unkempt hair and a rumpled jacket that looked like it had seen better days. No backpack, no phone in hand, nothing to occupy him. He was just standing there, staring directly at me. At first, I brushed it off. New York is full of oddballs, and staring isn't exactly a crime. Maybe he was lost in thought, or perhaps he recognized me from somewhere. A customer at the shop? I pulled out my phone and pretended to check emails, angling my body away from his line of sight. But every time I glanced up, his eyes were still locked on me, unblinking, like I was the only thing in the world worth looking at. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, but I told myself I was being paranoid. It was late. I was tired. The rumble of an approaching train echoed through the tunnel, and I felt a wave of relief. The electronic sign flickered. Uptown Express, not my line, but it would clear the platform a bit. As the cars whooshed by, I stole another look across the tracks. He hadn't moved an inch, still fixated on me, even as the train blocked our view momentarily. When it pulled away, there he was, unchanged. Okay, that's weird, I thought. I decided to let this one pass and wait for the local train that would actually take me home. Minutes ticked by, agonizingly slow in the stuffy underground air. I shifted my weight, checked the time again. 11:05. The platform had thinned out even more. The couple had boarded the express, leaving just me, the homeless guy, who was now dozing against a pillar, and a young woman with headphones blasting music loud enough for me to hear the bass. Finally, the local train's headlights pierced the darkness, and I positioned myself right by where the doors would open. As the train slowed to a stop, I boarded quickly, sliding into a seat near the middle of the car. It was mostly empty. A few night shift workers nodding off, an older man reading a newspaper. I exhaled, feeling the tension ease as the doors chimed their warning. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement on the opposite platform. The man was bolting down the stairs, his footsteps echoing like thunder. He darted across the connecting underpass. I could hear the slap of his shoes on the concrete, and emerged on my side just as the doors began to close. With a desperate lunge, he squeezed through, the doors clipping his jacket as they shut. My heart slammed against my ribs. He scanned the car briefly, spotted me, and sat down just 2 seats away, across the aisle. not right next to me, but close enough that I could smell the faint odor of stale sweat and something metallic, like old coins. His stare was back, intense and unwavering, his hands clenched in his lap. No words, no smile, just that piercing gaze. Panic surged through me. Was this some kind of game? A stalker? Or worse, someone unhinged? I gripped my bag tighter, my mind racing through escape plans. The next stop was only a minute away. A busier station with more people, more exits. The train lurched forward, and I forced myself to breathe steadily, avoiding eye contact. I could feel his eyes boring into me, but I stared at the ads on the wall. Lawyers promising quick settlements, language apps touting fluency in weeks. When the announcer crackled, "Next stop, 14th Street," I stood up casually, as if it were my intended destination all along. The doors opened, and I stepped out into a throng of late-night revelers spilling from nearby bars. I wove through them, ducking behind a group of laughing friends, then glanced back at the train. He hadn't moved. He was still seated, watching me through the window as the doors closed and the cars pulled away. I didn't relax until I was above ground, hailing a cab with shaking hands. The driver, a chatty guy from Queens, must have sensed my unease because he asked if I was okay. I mumbled something about a long day and gave him my address. Back home, I double-checked the locks, made a cup of tea I didn't drink, and replayed the encounter in my head. The next day, I reported it to the MTA's non-emergency line, describing him as best I could. Average height, dark hair, gray jacket. They took the details, but said without an incident, there wasn't much they could do. I started varying my routes home after that, sometimes taking the bus or ride shares, and I made a point to travel with co-workers when shifts ran late. Looking back, I think he might have been harmless. Maybe someone dealing with mental health issues, lost in his own world, or even mistaking me for someone else. But in that moment, it felt like pure instinct kicked in, and I'm glad it did. The city can be unpredictable, but I've learned to trust my gut. No dramatic chase, no lingering mystery. Just a reminder to stay vigilant in a place that never sleeps. It was a Tuesday night in late October, the kind where the chill in the air seeps into your bones even before you step outside. I'd just finished my shift at the diner downtown, another long one, slinging greasy plates and weak coffee until the clock struck midnight. By the time I clocked out and made my way to the subway, it was pushing 1 a.m. The streets above were quiet, save for the distant wail of a siren and the rustle of fallen leaves skittering across the sidewalk like tiny ghosts. I descended the stairs into the station, my sneakers echoing off the tiled walls, amplifying the emptiness. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the place feel even more abandoned. No ticket vendors, no other commuters. Just me and the stale smell of damp concrete mixed with faint urine. I swiped my card through the turnstile and headed down to the platform for the uptown train. That's when I first noticed him. A man at the far end, maybe 50 feet away, leaning against one of the support pillars. He was wrapped in a grimy overcoat that looked like it hadn't seen a wash in months. The kind of coat that screamed down on his luck, or maybe something worse. No backpack, no newspaper, no phone in his hand to scroll through like everyone does these days. He wasn't pacing or checking the arrival board. He was just standing there, his eyes fixed in my direction. At first, I brushed it off. New York is full of oddballs, and late-night subways attract all sorts. I told myself he was probably waiting for the same train, lost in his own thoughts. But as I walked further along the platform to my usual spot near the middle, where the cars tend to stop, I heard the scrape of shoes behind me. Not hurried, not casual, just deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, mirroring my movement, keeping that same buffer of distance. My heart picked up a notch. I stopped, pretending to check the digital sign overhead that flashed, "Next train, 15 minutes." He stopped too. No expression on his face, just a blank stare, like he was studying me. His eyes were shadowed under a wool cap pulled low, but I could feel them boring into me. I shifted again, this time toward the end of the platform, nearer the stairs, hoping maybe he'd stay put or head the other way. Nope. He adjusted his position accordingly, hands shoved deep in his pockets, never breaking that eerie lock on me. A knot tightened in my stomach. The platform was dead silent, except for the occasional drip from a leaky pipe somewhere in the ceiling and the low hum of the tracks below. I pulled out my phone, fingers fumbling a bit, and tried to text my roommate. Weird guy at station, train delayed. But underground, the signal was non-existent. No bars, no service. Just a useless brick in my hand. I shoved it back in my pocket and scanned the area for any security cameras or emergency buttons. There was one of those blue-lit call boxes mounted on the wall, but it was a good 20 feet away, and getting to it would mean turning my back on him or walking closer. I decided against it for the moment, not wanting to escalate things if it was all in my head. The minutes dragged on like hours. I kept my eyes on the tracks, willing the train to rumble in early, but the board stubbornly ticked down. 14 minutes, 13, 12. He didn't say a word, didn't approach, didn't even shift his weight much, just watched. I could feel the prickle of sweat under my jacket despite the cool air. My mind raced through scenarios. Was he homeless and harmless? High on something? Or worse, targeting me because I was alone? I'd heard stories from friends about creeps on the subway, but living through it was different. I edged toward the conductor's usual spot, figuring if the train came, I'd bolt for the front car where the operator sits. Safety and proximity, right? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the distant screech of metal on rails echoed through the tunnel. Headlights pierced the darkness, and the train whooshed in, doors sliding open with a pneumatic hiss. I didn't hesitate. I darted into the first car, planting myself right by the window that looks into the conductor's booth. The car was empty, except for a couple of nodding off passengers further back. I glanced out the window as the doors chimed their warning. There he was, still on the platform, right at the edge. He hadn't moved to board. Instead, as the train lurched forward, he cracked a smile, slow, deliberate, like he'd won some private game. It sent a shiver down my spine, but then he was gone, swallowed by the blur of the station walls. I rode the whole way home with my back pressed against the seat, eyes darting to every stop, half expecting him to appear on another platform. When I finally got to my apartment, I locked the door behind me and told my roommate everything over a cup of tea. She convinced me to report it the next day. I called the MTA's non-emergency line and gave them a description, though I doubted much would come of it without video or a name. They said they'd flag it for patrols. Looking back, maybe he was just a lonely guy with poor social cues, or maybe he got a kick out of scaring people. Either way, it shook me enough that I started adjusting my routine. No more late-night shifts if I could help it. and I switched to a different station a few blocks over, even if it meant a longer walk. It's busier there, with more people around. Life goes on, but that night taught me to trust my gut and to always check the train times before heading down. Back when I was living in New York City, scraping by as a bartender in the East Village, my shifts often ran late into the night. I'd finish up around 2 a.m., help close the place down, and then trudge to the subway station for the long ride back to my cramped apartment in Queens. One particular night stands out in my memory like a bad dream I can't quite shake. Though looking back, it was probably just one of those raw, unfiltered glimpses into the city's underbelly. It was a humid summer evening that had dragged into the early hours, around 3 a.m., and I'd missed the earlier train by mere minutes after lingering too long over a post-shift beer with a coworker. The platform at the 14th Street station was eerily deserted, the kind of quiet that amplifies every little sound. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that incessant, headache-inducing hum, casting harsh shadows across the tiled floors streaked with grime from the day's foot traffic. In the distance, I could hear the slow drip of water leaking from some unseen pipe in the ceiling, echoing like a metronome in the stillness. The air was thick with the stale scent of urine and rust, mixed with the faint metallic tang of the tracks below. I slumped onto a worn metal bench, my backpack at my feet, scrolling mindlessly through my phone to kill time and ward off the creeping boredom. That's when I first noticed the whispering. It started soft, almost indistinguishable from the ambient noise, like a radio tuned low in another room. I glanced around, but the platform was empty. No other late-night stragglers, no security guard making rounds. The sound seemed to be coming from behind one of the massive concrete columns that supported the station's roof, about 20 feet away. I strained to listen, figuring it might be someone on a phone call, but the words didn't make sense. It was a jumble of fragmented phrases. Not now. Shadows no. Can't hide forever. The voice was male, rough and gravelly, laced with an urgency that sent a small chill up my spine, despite the muggy air. As the minutes ticked by, the muttering grew louder, escalating into what sounded like a heated argument. He was shouting now, disjointed words like "betrayed" and "watching me," as if debating with an invisible adversary. My pulse quickened. I'd seen enough odd behavior in the city to know when to keep my distance. But curiosity mixed with unease kept me rooted to the spot. I considered moving to the other end of the platform, but the train was due any minute, and I didn't want to risk missing it. Then, without warning, he emerged. Not standing, but crawling out on all fours, his movements jerky and animalistic, like a crab scuttling across the beach. He was disheveled, a middle-aged man in a tattered coat that might have once been black, but was now faded to gray, his hair matted and wild, face smeared with dirt. His eyes were wide, darting around as if searching for threats in the empty space. He covered the distance quickly, stopping just a few feet from where I sat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He tilted his head up, locking eyes with me, and let out a laugh that started low in his chest and built into something deep and guttural, more like a growl than anything human. It echoed off the walls, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. My heart hammered in my chest, adrenaline flooding my system. I gripped my phone tighter, ready to bolt if he made a move. My mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Robbery, assault, or just plain unpredictability. In that frozen moment, I didn't say a word. I just stared back, trying to project calm, while every instinct screamed to run. But before anything could escalate, the distant rumble of the approaching train cut through the tension. The headlights pierced the tunnel, and the screech of metal on rails filled the air. The man snapped his head toward the sound, his laughter cutting off abruptly. In a flash, he scrambled backward on all fours, retreating behind the column like a startled creature hiding from a predator. Maybe he was avoiding the conductor or didn't have a fare. I didn't know, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I jumped up, grabbed my bag, and hurried to the edge of the platform as the train slowed to a stop. The doors hissed open, and I darted inside, choosing a car with a couple of other passengers, a weary-looking nurse in scrubs and a guy in a delivery uniform nodding off to sleep. The doors closed with a reassuring beep, and as the train lurched forward, I pressed my face to the window, peering back at the platform. There he was, peeking out from behind the pillar, his eyes fixed on the departing train. Our gazes met one last time through the grimy glass, and then he was gone, swallowed by the receding station. I collapsed into a seat, my hands shaking as I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The rest of the ride home was uneventful, just the familiar sway of the car and the occasional announcement over the speakers. By the time I got to my stop and walked the few blocks to my building, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me exhausted but relieved. Looking back on it now, years later, I figure the guy was probably struggling with mental health issues or maybe under the influence. New York has no shortage of folks falling through the cracks like that. It was scary in the moment, sure, but it ended without incident. Just another story from the city's endless parade of the weird and weary. I made a point after that to avoid those graveyard shift trains when I could, opting for a cab or an earlier closeout. Life in the city teaches you to stay alert, but it also reminds you that most encounters, even the unsettling ones, fade into the background once the sun comes up. One crisp autumn morning in 2018, I found myself on the subway platform at my usual stop in downtown Chicago, waiting for the early train to work. It was around 6 a.m., that hazy hour when the city is just starting to stir but still feels half asleep. The platform was nearly deserted. Most people were probably still buried under their blankets, nursing their first cups of coffee at home. A faint chill hung in the air, carrying the distant rumble of traffic from the streets above, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like tired insects. I paced a little to stay warm, my breath visible in small puffs, clutching my thermos of black coffee like a lifeline. A few feet away, on one of those scratched-up metal benches bolted to the concrete, sat a man I hadn't noticed at first. He was bundled in a long, weathered trench coat that looked like it had seen better decades. Dark wool, frayed at the cuffs, with a collar turned up against the draft from the tunnel. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. But from what I could see, he appeared middle-aged, with a scruffy beard and lines etched deep into his forehead, as if worry had carved them there over years. He sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead at the tracks without so much as a twitch. At first, I paid him no mind. I was scrolling through emails on my phone, mentally mapping out my day at the office. A string of meetings and deadlines that already had me feeling drained. But then I caught a murmur, low and rhythmic, cutting through the quiet. I assumed it was him talking on a Bluetooth headset. Plenty of people do that these days, chatting away to invisible callers. The words were indistinct at first, blending with the occasional echo of a far-off train horn. I glanced over subtly. No earpiece that I could spot. His lips were moving just enough to form sounds, but his eyes remained fixed on the empty tracks, never once flicking in my direction. As I tuned in, the whispers sharpened into coherence, and a chill unrelated to the morning air prickled my skin. "Don't move. They'll see you," he said. His voice a gravelly hush, like wind rustling through dry leaves. Then, after a pause, "Stay still. They're watching." It wasn't loud, barely above a breath. But in the emptiness of the platform, it carried straight to me. My heart picked up a notch. Was he talking to himself? Or to me? I froze, pretending to focus on my phone, but my peripheral vision stayed locked on him. He didn't shift, didn't acknowledge me at all, yet the phrases felt eerily directed, as if he were narrating my every thought. "The shadows know. Don't let them catch your eye." I felt exposed, like I'd stumbled into some private delusion that had somehow roped me in. Minutes stretched on like that. Me standing rigid, him whispering these cryptic warnings about unseen threats, his tone urgent but monotonous, like a looped recording. I considered moving farther down the platform, but something held me back. Curiosity mixed with a dash of unease. What if he was unstable? What if confronting him escalated things? The rational part of my brain screamed to ignore it, but the words burrowed in, making the familiar station feel alien. The air seemed thicker, the lights dimmer, and every distant clank from the tracks jolted me. Finally, the screech of approaching wheels pierced the tension. My train pulled in with a whoosh of compressed air, doors sliding open like an invitation to escape. I bolted aboard without a backward glance, heart pounding, as I claimed a seat by the window. As the doors hissed shut, I could still hear his voice faintly through the glass. "Stay hidden. They're close." Fading as the train lurched forward into the tunnel. I spent the ride replaying it in my head, adrenaline slowly ebbing into bewilderment. By the time I got to work, I'd convinced myself it was just one of those odd city encounters. A guy off his meds, maybe, or dealing with some personal demons. Chicago's full of them. Public transit is a melting pot of the eccentric and the overlooked. Later that week, I mentioned it to a coworker who'd ridden the same line for years. Turns out, she'd seen someone matching the description before. A regular on the early shifts, harmless but known for muttering to himself about watchers and conspiracies. Probably schizophrenia or something similar, she said. The transit cops kept an eye on him, but never had to intervene. Looking back, it was unsettling in the moment, but nothing more than a brush with someone else's reality bleeding into mine. I switched to a later train after that, just to avoid the awkwardness. And life moved on. Meetings, deadlines, the usual grind. The city has a way of swallowing those fleeting weirdnesses, turning them into anecdotes over drinks. Still, every now and then, on quiet mornings, I catch myself listening a little closer to the whispers in the wind. It was the fall of 2008, and I was a sophomore at Boston University, juggling classes, part-time work at a coffee shop near campus, and the usual chaos of college life. I lived in one of those cramped dorms on Commonwealth Avenue. Nothing fancy, just a shared room with a roommate who was always blasting indie rock. The address was something I rarely thought about. It was just home base in a city that felt both exhilarating and overwhelming. That evening, I was heading back from a late study session downtown. It was around 8 p.m., and I'd taken the Green Line to Park Street Station to switch trains. Park Street is one of those classic Boston hubs. Old brick walls, echoing announcements, and a constant shuffle of people. Commuters in suits, tourists with maps, students like me with backpacks slung over one shoulder. The platform was moderately crowded, not rush hour packed, but enough that I felt anonymous in the mix. I stood there scrolling through my flip phone, texting a friend about grabbing pizza later, while waiting for the next inbound train. Out of nowhere, this guy approached me. He looked to be in his mid-50s, average height, with salt and pepper hair neatly combed and a clean-shaven face. He was dressed like any other professional. Khaki pants, a button-down shirt under a light jacket, and a leather messenger bag hanging from his shoulder. Nothing about him screamed threat. No wild eyes, no disheveled clothes. He just walked up casually, like he knew me from somewhere. Before I could even look up fully, he leaned in slightly and said, "Clear as day, Emily Rebecca Thompson." That was my full name. First, middle, last. No one called me by all three except maybe my parents during a scolding or on official forms. I froze, my phone still in hand, staring at him. How did he know that? My mind raced. Was he a professor I'd forgotten? A family friend? He didn't stop there. With the same calm tone, like he was reciting directions, he added, "You live at 123 Commonwealth Avenue, Warren Towers, room 412. My dorm address, exact down to the room number. My heart started pounding. The platform noise faded into a buzz. I managed to stammer, "Who are you? How do you know that?" He just smiled, a polite, almost paternal smile, not creepy or smug, and said, "You should be careful tonight." That was it. No explanation, no follow-up. The train rumbled into the station right then, doors hissing open. And he turned, stepped aboard without another word, vanishing into the crowd inside. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the doors closed and the train pulled away. Part of me wanted to jump on after him, demand answers, but fear, or maybe instinct, kept me planted. I didn't get on the next train. Instead, I hightailed it up to street level, found a bench near the entrance, and called my roommate to come meet me. My hands were shaking as I dialed campus police from there. They took my report over the phone initially. Then I went in person the next morning to give a full description. Age, build, clothing, even the style of his bag. I sketched what I could remember of his face for them. Nothing distinctive, really, just an everyman look. They said they'd look into it, check security footage from the station if MBTA shared it, and advised me to vary my routine, avoid being alone at night, the standard stuff. In the days that followed, I was on edge. I changed my locks. Dorm maintenance helped with that. Started walking with friends everywhere, and even switched up my class routes to avoid predictable patterns. I scoured my social media. Back then it was mostly Facebook. And tightened privacy settings, wondering if I'd overshared somehow. Maybe he'd seen my info on a lost ID or something innocuous. My friends theorized everything from a random stalker to a mistaken identity, but nothing clicked. Campus police followed up a week later. No matches on footage, the cameras were grainy back then. No similar reports from other students. They figured it might have been a prank or someone trying to rattle me for kicks. Boston had its share of oddballs. Nothing came of it officially, and I never saw the guy again. No follow-up incidents, no creepy calls or notes. As time passed, the fear ebbed. By spring semester, it was more of an anecdote I shared at parties. Remember that weird subway guy? Then a nightmare. I graduated in 2010, moved on to a job in New York, and life normalized. Looking back, I think he might have been a well-meaning but misguided Samaritan. Maybe he'd overheard me on a phone call earlier or seen my info on a discarded paper. And the "be careful" was just generic advice for a young woman in the city. Or perhaps he was connected to the university in some admin role and recognized me from records. Whatever it was, it taught me a lasting lesson about situational awareness. These days, I still double-check my surroundings on public transit, but I've let go of the mystery. Life's full of unexplained moments, and not all of them need to end in drama. It was a chilly autumn night in the city, the kind where the streets empty out early and the subway feels like a ghost town after midnight. I'd just finished a long shift at the restaurant downtown, waiting tables until my feet ached and my apron smelled like spilled coffee and greasy fries. The train home was mostly deserted, just a few scattered passengers hunched over their phones or dozing against the windows. I slumped into a seat near the middle of the car, pulling out my own phone to scroll mindlessly through social media, trying to unwind before crashing into bed. That's when I noticed her. She was sitting directly across from me, maybe 4 or 5 rows away, in one of those hard plastic seats that face inward. She looked ordinary at first glance, mid-40s perhaps, with short, mousy brown hair tucked behind her ears, wearing a faded gray coat that hung loosely on her frame, and sensible black shoes that screamed office worker. But her eyes, they were fixed on me. Not the casual glance you might exchange with a stranger, but a direct, unwavering stare. Her eyelids didn't flutter. She didn't blink. It was as if she'd locked onto me like a camera lens, capturing every detail without pause. At first, I thought it was nothing. People zone out on trains all the time, right? Maybe she was lost in thought, her mind wandering while her gaze happened to land on me. I shifted in my seat, crossing my legs and pretending to focus on my screen. But after a minute or two, I peeked up again, still staring. No change. Her expression was blank, neutral, almost empty, like she wasn't really seeing me as a person, but as an object of study. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The train rattled along the tracks, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everything feel a little more isolated. 5 minutes ticked by. I checked the time on my phone, willing the stops to come faster. The car was quiet, except for the occasional screech of metal on metal and the muffled announcements over the intercom. I tried to ignore her, but it was impossible. Her eyes were pale blue, I realized now, wide and unblinking, reflecting the overhead lights like glass. 10 minutes. I coughed deliberately, clearing my throat louder than necessary, hoping to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. Nothing. Not even a flicker. I adjusted my bag on my lap, uncrossed and recrossed my legs, even stood up briefly as if stretching before sitting back down. Her head didn't move, but her eyes followed me seamlessly, maintaining that locked-on intensity. By 15 minutes, My heart was pounding a little harder. The train wasn't crowded, but there were a couple of other people in the car. A guy in a hoodie nodding off to music in his earbuds. An older woman reading a paperback. I considered saying something like, "Can I help you?" But the words stuck in my throat. What if she was harmless? What if she had some condition, like a neurological thing that made her stare? Or worse, what if confronting her escalated things? The city subways had their share of odd characters, and I'd heard enough stories from friends about unpredictable encounters to make me cautious. Still, the discomfort built like a knot in my stomach. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she was peeling back layers with just her gaze. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The next stop was approaching. Some dimly lit platform in a residential neighborhood, not my usual one, but close enough. As the doors slid open with a chime, I grabbed my bag and hurried to the connecting door between cars, slipping into the next one. It was emptier still, just a single passenger asleep at the far end. I sat down quickly, my pulse racing, and glanced back through the small window in the door. She hadn't moved at first, but then, slowly, she stood up. Her coat swayed as she turned toward the connecting doors, her eyes still fixed in my direction, even through the glass. She began walking, deliberate steps, not rushing but not hesitating either. Panic surged through me. Was she following? Why? The train lurched forward as the doors closed, and I watched her hand reach for the handle between cars. I didn't wait to see if she'd cross over. At the very next stop, 2 before mine, I bolted out onto the platform, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The station was quiet. A few late-night commuters milling about, but I didn't linger. I jogged up the stairs to street level, hailed the first cab I saw, a yellow one idling at the curb, and slid into the back seat, giving the driver my address in a rush. The ride home was short, maybe 10 minutes, but it felt eternal. I kept glancing out the rear window, half expecting to see her somehow trailing behind, though logically I knew that was impossible. The cab driver, a chatty guy with a thick accent, asked if I was okay, noticing my fidgeting. I mumbled something about a weird night and tipped him extra when we pulled up to my building. Once inside my apartment, I locked the door, double-checked the deadbolt, and sank onto the couch. My hands were still shaky as I poured myself a glass of water. Looking back, I rationalized it. Maybe she had autism or some other condition that affected social cues, or perhaps she was on medication that caused dry eyes and staring spells. Or hell, maybe she was just exhausted and spacing out, and my paranoia filled in the blanks. Whatever it was, I got home safe, and that was what mattered. I changed my routine after that, taking an earlier train when possible and sitting near groups of people. The city is full of strange moments like that. Most fade into anecdotes you share over drinks. This one did too, eventually. Just a reminder to trust your gut when something feels off. It was a late autumn evening in 2018, back when I was working the closing shift at a small bookstore in downtown Chicago. I'd taken the L train home as usual, but that night, the station was quieter than normal, probably because of the chilly rain that had been drizzling on and off all day. By the time I got off at my stop, it was pushing midnight, and the platform felt deserted. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows on the tiled floors. and the air had that damp, metallic tang from the tracks below. The escalators leading up to street level were out of order, a common annoyance in those old stations. A yellow caution sign blocked the way, so I had no choice but to take the stairs. A steep, narrow flight that seemed to go on forever, maybe 50 or 60 steps in total. I sighed, adjusted my backpack, and started climbing. My sneakers squeaked softly on the worn metal edges, and the echo of my own footsteps bounced off the concrete walls, making the space feel even more isolated. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The only sounds were the distant rumble of a train pulling away and the faint drip of water from somewhere in the ceiling. About halfway up, maybe around the 25th step, I heard it. Heavy footsteps behind me. Not light or hurried, but deliberate. Thud, thud, thud. Like someone in boots was ascending at a steady pace. My heart skipped a beat. I paused for a second, listening. But the steps kept coming, syncing almost with mine, but just a fraction off. I glanced over my shoulder quickly, expecting to see another late-night commuter. Maybe someone who'd been lingering on the platform. But there was no one there. The stairs stretched empty below me, disappearing into the dim glow of the lower level. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably an echo playing tricks. Old stations like that are full of weird acoustics. Still, a prickle of unease crept up my neck. I picked up my pace, taking the steps 2 at a time now, my breath coming a little faster. And that's when the footsteps behind me sped up too, matching my rhythm almost perfectly. Thud, 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 thud. I whipped around again, more forcefully this time, my hand gripping the cold railing. Nothing. Just shadows and the faint outline of the platform far below. My mind raced. Was it someone hiding in the blind spots? Or maybe sound carrying from another staircase? But no. This was the only way up from that side. By then, adrenaline was kicking in. I bolted the rest of the way, my legs burning as I reached the top landing. The turnstiles were just ahead, their metal arms gleaming under the brighter lights of the exit area. I fumbled for my transit card, swiped it with shaky hands, and pushed through, the clank of the mechanism echoing loudly. As I emerged into the vestibule, I couldn't resist glancing back down the staircase one last time. And there he was, a man standing at the very bottom, just outside the pool of light from the platform lamps. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured in shadow. But I could tell he was staring right up at me. He didn't move, didn't wave or call out. He just stood there, motionless, like he'd been watching the whole time. My stomach dropped. I didn't wait to see if he'd follow. I turned and ran out onto the street, the rain-slicked sidewalk blurring under my feet as I sprinted the 3 blocks to my apartment building. The neighborhood was quiet, streetlights reflecting off puddles, and no one else was around to notice my panic. I burst through my front door, locked it behind me, and leaned against the wall, catching my breath. My heart pounded for what felt like hours. And I kept peeking out the window, half expecting to see him lurking outside. The next day, I reported it to the station attendant, just in case. Turns out, there had been a few complaints about a homeless guy who sometimes hung around the lower levels, not causing trouble but scaring people unintentionally. The police checked it out, and from what I heard later through a friend who worked transit security, they moved him along to a shelter. Nothing sinister, just someone down on their luck who probably didn't realize how creepy it came across in the dead of night. I started taking an earlier train after that, and I never had another incident like it. Looking back, It was terrifying in the moment. But in the end, it was just one of those urban encounters that reminds you to stay aware. Nothing more than a scare that faded with time. I had only been in the city for a couple of weeks when it happened. Fresh out of college, I'd landed my first real job in Manhattan, and everything felt like an adventure. The towering skyscrapers, the endless streams of people, the chaotic energy that pulsed through the streets. But the subway? That was a whole different beast. I'd heard the basics from friends back home. Avoid eye contact, hold your bag close, and always stand clear of the closing doors. No one mentioned the unwritten rules, though, like the one about empty cars during rush hour. It was a Tuesday evening, right around 6 p.m., peak commuter time. The platform at Times Square was a madhouse. Bodies pressed together like sardines, elbows jostling, the air thick with the smell of sweat, hot pretzels from a nearby vendor, and that unmistakable metallic tang of the tracks. The train pulled in with a screech, doors sliding open to reveal packed cars bursting with tired office workers, tourists clutching maps, and street performers hauling their gear. I scanned for any space, my backpack heavy on my shoulders from a long day of orientation meetings. Then I spotted it. One car, toward the end of the train, completely empty, not a single soul inside. It looked like an oasis in the desert. Clean seats, no one to bump into, room to actually breathe. I thought, jackpot, maybe it's just luck. I was naive like that, still seeing the city through rose-tinted glasses. Without a second thought, I hopped on just as the doors chimed their warning. The car was eerily quiet as the train lurched forward. The usual hum of conversations from adjacent cars muffled through the walls. At first, it was blissful. I sank into a seat by the window, stretched my legs, and pulled out my phone to scroll through emails. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the graffiti-scratched windows and faded ads for injury lawyers. But then, maybe a minute into the ride, I heard a faint scraping sound from the end of the car, like metal on metal. I glanced up, figuring it was just the train rattling over the tracks. That's when he appeared. The door connecting to the next car creaked open. No, not the passenger door, but the emergency one between cars, the kind you're not supposed to use while the train is moving. A man shuffled in, his clothes ragged and caked with grime, like he'd been sleeping rough for weeks. His hair was matted, his eyes wild and darting, and in his hand he gripped the neck of a shattered beer bottle, the jagged edges glinting under the lights. He didn't notice me at first, or maybe he did and didn't care. He started pacing up and down the aisle, muttering to himself in a low, incoherent growl. Words like, "They're coming," and "not again," interspersed with curses. My heart slammed into overdrive. I froze in my seat, every instinct screaming to run. But where? The train was barreling through the tunnel, no stops in sight. He slammed the bottle against one of the metal poles with a sharp crack, sending tiny shards skittering across the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the empty space. He did it again, harder, his pacing quickening, his mutters turning into shouts. I pressed myself against the window, trying to make myself small, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Was he high, mentally unstable, looking for trouble? I gripped my phone, debating whether to call 911. But the signal was spotty underground. And what would I even say? there's a guy with a broken bottle on the subway. Time stretched into an eternity. I didn't dare move, didn't breathe too loudly. He kept glancing around, as if expecting someone else. But thankfully, he never directly approached me. Maybe he was too lost in his own world. The train finally slowed as we approached the next station. 42nd Street, I think. The platform lights flickered into view, and I could see the crowd waiting outside. The doors opened with a whoosh, and people flooded in. Commuters in suits, a group of teenagers laughing, a mom with a stroller. The car filled up in seconds, the normal bustle breaking the tension like a popped balloon. The man paused his pacing, bottle still in hand, but with all the new eyes on him, he seemed to shrink back. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. As the crowd surged, I slipped out the nearest door, weaving through bodies until I was safely in the adjacent car, packed but reassuringly normal. I rode the rest of the way home in a daze, my pulse still thumping, replaying the scene over and over. When I got to my tiny apartment in Brooklyn, I collapsed on the couch, grateful to be in one piece. The next day at work, I mentioned it casually to a coworker during lunch. Sarah, who'd been in the city for years and knew all the ins and outs. Her eyes widened. "You got on an empty car during rush hour? Rookie mistake." There's always a reason it's empty. Could be a homeless person acting out, vomit on the seats, or worse. Never trust an empty subway car. It's like the city's way of warning you. I nodded, feeling a mix of embarrassment and relief. She was right, of course. From then on, I stuck to the crowded cars, even if it meant standing the whole way. The city had taught me its first hard lesson, and I wasn't about to forget it. Over time, I got smarter about navigating the subways, learning the routes, spotting the signs of trouble, blending in with the flow. That encounter didn't scar me for life. It just made me more aware, more street smart. And honestly, in a place as unpredictable as New York, that's the best armor you can have. It was back in 1997, and I was just 19 years old, fresh out of school and navigating the chaotic world of London on my own for the first time. I'd landed a part-time gig at a record shop in the West End, which meant late shifts that often had me catching the last trains home on the Central Line. That particular night, I think it was a Thursday in late autumn. The air was crisp and biting outside, but down in the underground, it was the usual stuffy mix of stale air, echoing announcements, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights flickering overhead. I boarded at Oxford Circus around 11:30 p.m., heading west toward my flat in Shepherd's Bush. The carriage was sparsely populated, as it often was at that hour. A couple of tired office workers scrolling through newspapers, a young woman with headphones nodding off to sleep, and an older gentleman clutching a takeaway bag that smelled faintly of fish and chips. I settled into a seat near the doors, pulling out a dog-eared copy of Train Spotting to pass the time. The train rattled along, stopping at Tottenham Court Road, then Holborn, Chancery Lane, each station bringing in a trickle of passengers before emptying out again. It was somewhere between Chancery Lane and St. Paul's when he got on. The man was in his mid-40s, I'd guess, dressed impeccably in a charcoal gray business suit that looked tailored. Crisp white shirt, red tie knotted perfectly, polished black shoes that reflected the carriage lights. He had short, neatly combed dark hair with a touch of gray at the temples, and a clean-shaven face that seemed ordinary enough, though his expression was blank, almost vacant. In his right hand, He carried an old-fashioned brown leather suitcase, the kind you might see in a vintage shop or inherited from a grandfather, scuffed at the edges with brass latches that had seen better days. It didn't match his polished appearance at all, which struck me as odd even then. He sat down directly across from me, placing the suitcase on the floor between his feet. He didn't fiddle with a phone. This was 97 after all. Mobiles were still a luxury for most. Didn't read a paper, didn't even glance around. Just stared straight ahead at the opposite wall of the carriage, his hands resting lightly on his knees. I remember thinking he looked like someone who'd had a long, draining day at some corporate job, maybe in the city. Perhaps a banker or a lawyer, zoning out on the commute home. The train continued its journey. Bank, Liverpool Street, Bethnal Green, Mile End. Stations blurred by, and he didn't move a muscle. As we approached Notting Hill Gate, the automated voice crackled over the speakers. "This is Notting Hill Gate. A light here for the Circle and District lines." The man stood up abruptly, smoothed his tie with one hand, and stepped toward the doors. But the suitcase, he left it right there on the floor, forgotten like an afterthought. I blinked, assuming he'd realize, and turned back. But the doors hissed open, and he walked out onto the platform without a backward glance. "Hey, mate, your suitcase," I called out, half standing from my seat. A couple of other passengers chimed in too. A woman in a wool coat shouted, "Sir, you forgot your bag." And the older gent with the takeaway bag even waved his arm. But the man didn't react. He just kept walking, his stride steady and unhurried, disappearing into the crowd, milling toward the exits. The doors closed, and the train pulled away, leaving us all exchanging puzzled looks. The carriage buzzed with murmurs. "That was weird," the woman said, eyeing the suitcase warily. "Should we, I don't know, pull the alarm?" Back then, in the late 90s, London was still on edge from IRA bombings and threats. Suitcases left unattended weren't just suspicious. They were potential disasters. Someone did pull the emergency cord at the next stop, Queensway, and the train ground to a halt. The driver came over the intercom, sounding annoyed at first, but once we explained, his tone shifted to serious. "Stay calm, folks. Security's on the way." We were all ushered off the train and onto the platform, which was quickly cordoned off. Transport police arrived within minutes. 2 officers in high-vis vests, radios crackling. They took statements from those of us who'd seen the man, jotting down descriptions: suit, suitcase, blank stare. I told them everything I could remember, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves, like I was part of some thriller movie. The platform was evacuated entirely, and they brought in the bomb disposal unit from the Metropolitan Police. We waited upstairs in the station concourse, a growing crowd of displaced passengers sipping bad coffee from a nearby vending machine, swapping theories. Was it a bomb? Drugs? Some kind of protest? It felt like forever. Probably about an hour, though time drags in those situations. But eventually, word filtered back. The squad had x-rayed the suitcase first, then carefully opened it under controlled conditions. And inside? Nothing. Absolutely empty. Not a scrap of paper, not a forgotten umbrella, zilch. The officers seemed as baffled as we were, but relieved. No threat, no evacuation needed beyond that point. The train service resumed and we were allowed to board the next one home. I finally got back to my flat around 1:30 a.m., adrenaline still buzzing, replaying the night in my head. The next day, I followed up out of curiosity, called the transport police hotline they'd given us. Turns out they'd reviewed the CCTV footage from Notting Hill Gate. They saw the man alight from the train, walk up the stairs to the ticket hall, and then nothing. He didn't appear on the exit cameras or the street-level ones. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. But here's where it gets grounded. After some digging, they figured out there was a blind spot in the camera coverage back then, a short corridor near the barriers where maintenance work had temporarily knocked out a feed. It wasn't uncommon in the older stations. The system wasn't as seamless as it is now. They never identified him, though. No reports of a missing suitcase matching the description, no one coming forward. The police chalked it up to an absent-minded commuter, maybe someone who'd had one too many at a work drinks and spaced out. Or perhaps it was a deliberate act, a weird prank or a social experiment by some eccentric. The suitcase was logged as lost property and eventually disposed of after no claims. Life moved on. I went back to my shifts at the record shop, and the story became one of those odd anecdotes I trot out at parties. Looking back, it was probably just human error in a city full of distractions, nothing more sinister than that. But it did make me double-check my own bags on the tube for years afterward.